The large hospital was always quiet at night, a place where patients found care and comfort. I am one of the very few male dedicated nurses. One of my favorite patients was Mrs. Ava Kruger, a 105-year-old woman with eyes held decades of untold stories. Born in Germany, Mrs. Kruger had lived through a century of history, carrying with her memories of a life that spanned continents and eras. Recently, Mrs. Kruger had been feeling lightheaded and was admitted for observation. I made it a point to check on her regularly, enjoying our conversations about her long and eventful life. One evening, as I was doing my rounds, when I found her staring out the window, lost in thought. "Good evening, Miss Kruger," I said, softly, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "How are you feeling tonight?" She turned to me with a weak smile.
"Good evening, James. I'm just thinking."
"Oh, about anything in particular?" I asked, curiously.
"Oh, just the past. It's strange how it all comes back to you when you're old and alone."
She replied, her voice tinged with melancholy. She brushed my question away as if it was nothing to worry about. But I respected her space and just did my job, and just be someone that she could talk to. Over the next few days, I noticed a change in Mrs. Kruger. She seemed more withdrawn, her usual lively demeanor overshadowed by a lingering sadness. I decided to spend more time with her, hoping to lift up her spirits. On my day off, I decided to go the extra mile. I drove to the international store outside of town and found an old German store that sold German groceries and other retail items. Inside, I found the oldest man working there. He seemed to be the owner of the shop. I asked him what was a popular tea in Germany in 1930s. He was a little surprised by my request, but he suggested a traditional chamomile blend, commonly enjoyed during that era. I bought a box and waited for my next shift the next day to hurry back to the hospital. Later that day, I brewed a cup of chamomile tea and brought it to Mrs. Kruger's room. The aroma filled the air as I sat beside her. "Good morning, Mrs. Kruger. I thought you might like this," I said, handing her the cup. "It's a traditional German chamomile tea. I heard that it was popular during the 1930s. She took the cup, her eyes widened with surprise and delight.
"James, how did you find this? It smells just like home."
I smiled, pleased with her reaction. "I thought it might bring back some good memories. You just seemed a little down lately. Is there something on your mind?" She sighed deeply, looking down at the steamy cup in her hands.
"You know, James, when you live as long as I have, you collect a lot of memories. Some beautiful, some painful."
"Oh, I can only imagine. You've seen so much," I said, trying to encourage her to continue. She nodded slowly.
"Yes, I've seen so much. But there are some things I've never told anyone. Not even to my children and husband. God bless their souls. Secrets that have weighed on my heart for decades."
I felt a pang of concern. Mrs. Kruger, you can share anything with me. Sometimes talking about it just helps." For a moment, she seemed to consider my words, but then shook her head.
"Not yet, James. Maybe another time."
Of course, I respected her decision, but made sure to check on her frequently, engage in her conversations about her life. She told me many stories about her childhood in Germany, the friends she made, the adventures she had with the experiences. Despite these lighter moments, I could sense a shadow of unresolved sorrow. I continued to bring her tea and cookies that she requested from the store. I had no issues paying for them. I've now considered Mrs. Kruger a good friend of mine. She even gave me keys to her home so I can bring her photo albums. Over the following weeks, Mrs. Kruger began to open up a little bit, sharing snippets of her past that hinted at a deeper pain. She talked about her family, her strict father, and her loving but powerless mother. Each story seemed to bring her closer to the edge of the long-held secret. During this time, Mrs. Kruger's headaches, which had initially been the reason that she was being admitted, began to worsen. The doctors were puzzled by her condition and continued to run more tests to find the cause. However, I noticed something peculiar. When Mrs. Kruger talks about her past, her headaches seem to ease. One evening, as I was finishing my rounds, I found her looking through an old photo album. She pointed to a picture of a young man in a military uniform.
That's Günther. He was my first love.
I leaned in to look at the photo. Oh, very handsome. What happened to him?
He was taken by the war,
she said softly.
I never saw him again.
I saw the pain in her eyes and gently asked, "Is this the part where you've been holding on to?" Tears welled up in her eyes.
Part of it, yes. There's so much more, James. So much more.
This was the night. As I was sitting with her, she took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong.
James, I think I'm ready to tell you everything. It's time.
I nodded, feeling a mixture of anticipation and concern. Oh, are you sure, Mrs. Kruger? She smiled weakly, her eyes reflecting determination.
Yes, James, I trust you.
I squeezed her hand reassuringly. All right, I'm here. Please, take your time. As if on cue, I rose from my seat and retrieved the teapot and Mrs. Kruger's favorite teacup from the bedside table. Pouring the fragrant chamomile tea, I watched as the steam rose with delicate tendrils, filling the room as its comforting aroma. Mrs. Kruger accepted the cup with a graceful nod, cradling it in her hand. The porcelain felt warm against her skin, offering a small measure of comfort.
Thank you, James. This reminds me of home,
she murmured, taking a sip of the tea. I smiled softly. I'm glad it brings you some comfort. With a deep breath, Mrs. Kruger began to speak, her voice steady but tinged with emotion.
When I was a teenager in 1935, I fell in love with a young man named Günther. He was 18, and we were inseparable. Oh my God, he was very handsome, strong, smart, and had so much humor. I knew he was my soulmate. We were of course teenagers with a lot of love to share, so I got pregnant by accident. And we were overjoyed. But our happiness was short-lived. Günther was recruited to serve in World War II, and I never saw him again. We were at the train station near my home, and I gave him a tearful hug and much-needed kisses. He held my belly and said,
Wenn es ein Junge wird, kannst du ihn Günther nennen? Und wenn es ein Mädchen wird, Bella?
If it's a boy, can you name him Günther? And if she's a girl, name her Bella?
I felt a pang of sorrow for her as I listened intently. Oh, that must have been really hard for you. What happened next? Mrs. Kruger's voice trembled as she continued.
My father was a cruel man. He did not believe in premarital sex and teen pregnancies. It was against his morals, and we were already poor as it is. When I couldn't hide my pregnancy any longer, he demanded that my baby be put to death. If I refused, he threatened to leave the baby with the pigs on our farm to have him eaten. I told him I would just run away, but he was firm that he can easily find me. So I was terrified of him and my baby's birth.
I squeezed her hand tighter. I can't imagine how terrified you must have been. What did you do?
Months later, my kind mother helped me give birth. The baby was so beautiful, James. But my father was in the other room, drinking and throwing bottles in a fit of anger. When he heard the baby's cries, the bottle smashing ceased. My mother and I's breathing stopped when I heard his footsteps storming towards us. My mother quickly cut my cord and rushed to push the furniture dresser to hold the door shut. My mother showed me bravery to stand against my father, and my eyes filled with tears.
Renn, Liebes! Renn! Und bitte komm nicht mehr zurück! Renn einfach, Kind!
Run, my darling, run, and don't come back, please, my mother shouted.
Du gehst nirgendwo hin. Gib mir sofort dieses verdammte Kind.
Don't you fucking go anywhere! Give me that child now! My father shouted.
Mama, wohin soll ich gehen? Mom, where do I go?
Ich werde mit deinem Vater reden. Bitte, Schatz, ich halte es nicht mehr länger aus. Geh jetzt!
Just run, baby. I'll talk to your father. Please, baby. I can't hold this much longer. Go now! My mother shouts at me. I was scared for my strong-willed mother, but her eyes were sincere. I opened the window and carefully leaped over. I shut the window to cover my tracks. I walked quietly on the roof to the side of the house where there was a makeshift ladder my father built to fix the roof. I successfully made it to the grass, but as soon as I did, I heard my mother scream in pain. My father struck her. I ran while holding my sweet innocent baby. I made it about 100 feet towards the trees when my father stuck his head out of the window.
Eva! Ich werde dich finden! Dich und das verdammte Kind!
Ava! I'll fucking find you and that baby! My father shouted. His words froze me in my tracks. I couldn't move. But then I saw my mother briefly, with a bloody face, grabbing my father by the neck and pulling him back. My poor mother was buying me time despite her being weak and frail. Her bravery snapped me out of my frozen state, and I continued to run. I ran north of my home through the trees. In my intense fear of my baby and mother, I wished Günther to be there with me. That's when I remembered our secret place where none of our parents knew about yet. The Grand Tree, we called it. It was a beautiful shaped tree that looks like what you hear in the Bible. I walked through the empty farm fields toward the Grand Tree, holding my baby tight. The baby made sweet, innocent noises. I finally got a chance to see that he was a boy. Baby Günther, I called him. I loved my baby so much, but I knew I couldn't let him be food for the farm animals. I know my mother told me to run, but I didn't know anything outside my home. I didn't even understand how a car worked since my father never had one. We were poor farmers. I didn't know how to read, write, or speak other languages. My father did everything for us. I wouldn't last a day out anywhere. I looked at my baby and just knew that I wouldn't be able to provide for him. I had to make a terrible choice.
My heart ached for her as I gently brushed away her tears. You did what you thought was best in an impossible situation. You must have been scared and alone. Mrs. Kruger's voice broke as she remembered.
I walked to the nearby river and I drowned my baby. My soul shattered that day. As I embraced my lifeless baby, I remember screaming so loud that God himself probably heard me from heaven. I eventually collected myself and I buried my baby by the Grand Tree. The soil wet with my tears. I laid there for hours until I eventually gathered the strength to return home, where my father was sitting on the front porch. Drunk as always and shocked to see me alone with cuts from trees, and my outfit wet, and most importantly, without my baby.
I listened, my heart heavy with empathy. What happened when you got home? She took a deep breath, her eyes darkening with the memory.
My father grabbed my arm, demanding an answer.
Wo ist das Kind, Eva?
Where's the baby, Ava? He growled, his grip bruising my wrist. He sensed my calm demeanor, realizing that his attempts to instill fear no longer had an impact on me. But I gave him the most piercing death stare anyone on Earth could muster. Ich habe es getötet und beim großen Baum vergraben. I killed him, and I buried him by the grand tree, I told him, my voice cold and unwavering, with a fierce intensity burning in my eyes. I mustered every ounce of my being to convey the depth of my emotion. Ich wünschte einfach, du würdest tot umfallen und in der Hölle verrotten, wo du hingehörst! I wish you'd just drop dead and rot in hell where you belong. I seized the words heavy with the weight of years of anguish. Diese Welt ist Gottes Schöpfung und du bist nichts weiter als ein Fleck darauf. Ich verachte die Essenz deines Wesens und verabscheue jede Faser deiner Existenz. Du hast alles Reine und Gute in mir zerstört und nichts als Bitterkeit und Trauer zurückgelassen. This world is God's creation, and you're nothing but a stain on it. I despise the very essence of your being, loathing every fiber of your existence. You destroy everything pure and good within me, leaving nothing but bitterness and sorrow in your wake. Each syllable dripping with venom, echoing in the air as an indomitable declaration of my enduring resentment. His face fell, and for the first time he seemed to understand the horror of his ultimatum and was shocked by my words of venom. He collapsed on the front porch, crying in his pathetic state.
I felt a shiver run down my spine as she continued.
My mother, with remains of dry blood on her face, watched the whole thing. With tears in her eyes, she gave me a hug. She never spoke of that day again, and I never spoke to my father regardless of living under the same roof. But from then on, after the next few years, my mother secretly saved money for me. When I turned 20 in 1939, the war was ongoing and Günther hadn't returned to me. His letters had stopped arriving, so I only feared the worst. My mother gave me money and told me to leave, to start over in the United States. She knew we might never see each other again, but she wanted me to escape the past. Though she couldn't say it outright, she saw the impossible choice I had to make that day and sacrifice for me too. I hugged my mother tightly, said goodbye without a word to my father. That was the last time I saw them. She allowed me to leave that home and its painful memories behind.
I felt a lump in my throat as I held Mrs. Kruger's hands tighter. Your mother must have loved you so much to make this sacrifice, and you carried this burden for so long. You deserve peace.
Do you really think so, James? Do you think my baby can forgive me? And do you think Günther ever is in heaven with him?
I nodded, my own eyes misty. I believe your baby has already forgiven you. You did what you could in that moment of fear and love. And as for Günther, I believe he loved you deeply and would have been proud of you. You are a good person, Mrs. Kruger. And from what you told me, you had nothing but love for baby Günther. A faint smile touched her lips as she whispered,
Thank you, James. You've been so kind to me. You're my most dearest friend. If it's okay with you, I feel so sleepy. I'm just going to dream about my Günthers.
Before I could respond, the head nurse called me away to another room. Reluctantly, I left Mrs. Kruger, hoping our conversation had given her some measure of comfort. Another patient was walking down the hallway, all confused. The head nurse asked me to take care of him because he's a giant-sized man, and I'm the only male nurse on the floor. This behavior is very normal for this patient. Mr. Gomez, hi, I'm Nurse James. Do you remember me?
Leb wohl, mein.
The patient mumbled. I'm sorry, sir. Can you repeat yourself?
Leb wohl, mein Freund.
Whoa, are you speaking German, Mr. Gomez? English, Spanish, and now German? Did Mrs. Kruger teach you that? It sounds pretty good. Mr. Gomez is our confused patient. He's also old, but not as much as Mrs. Kruger. He kept repeating, "Le bol mi frun." I wanted to share this with Mrs. Kruger, so I quickly looked up on Google on what it meant. The results left me confused. It translated and I read out loud, "Goodbye, my friend." As soon as those words left my lips, an alert sounded from Mrs. Kruger's room. The nurses nearby shouted down the hallway. Panic surged through me. I sprinted towards her room, my heart pounding. Code blue means cardiac arrest or unresponsive patient. Most of the nurses rushed over to her bedside, since she was the floor's favorite patient. As I was running, I saw the young student nurses pushing a crash cart, with their faces pale with fear. I remember that she signed a DNR, Do Not Resuscitate order. DNR basically means, if I'm dying, don't revive me. Mrs. Kruger has signed it when she was first admitted. "Hey, put the crash cart back! She signed a DNR!" I shouted to the students, my voice strained with urgency. They hesitated, looking confused, before finally obeying. I pushed through the growing crowd outside her room. My coworker, Nurse Sarah, was holding Mrs. Kruger's arm, her face etched with sorrow. I squeezed through and saw Mrs. Kruger lying there, with her hands over her heart and a gentle smile on her face, tears still flowing. My hands trembled as I held her wrist to check for her pulse, then used my stethoscope to listen for her breathing, but there was nothing. She was truly gone. The room felt silent except for a small weeping of the nurses that grew to love her. I really hope her smile was because she saw someone that she deeply loved in her final moments. The thought brought a bittersweet comfort amidst the grief. I stood there feeling the weight of her passing, knowing that she was finally at peace. The other nurses were puzzled with her sudden death, but I believed that her confession had broken the curse, finally granting her the peace that she longed for. Over the next few days, I found myself often thinking about Mrs. Kruger and her tragic story. The hospital continued its routine, but I couldn't shake the weight of her words. One evening, as I sat in the break room with my colleague Sarah, I decided to share Mrs. Kruger's story. "You know, Sarah, Mrs. Kruger's story has been haunting me," I began, stirring my coffee absently. Sarah looked up from her phone, curious.
"What do you mean?"
I recounted the tale Mrs. Kruger had shared with me, watching as Sarah's expression shifted from interest to horror and then to sadness.
"That poor woman."
Sarah said softly.
"To carry such a burden for so long. It makes you realize how much people can hide beneath the surface."
I replied, "We see them every day, but we rarely know their deepest pains. The fact that she kept this for 89 years is just unimaginable." Sarah nodded thoughtfully.
"It's a reminder of why we do what we do, isn't it? To offer comfort and care, even when we can't change their past."
We sat in silence for a moment, each lost in our own thoughts. The intercom crackled to life, calling us back to our duties. As I made my way to the dimly lit corridors, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Mrs. Kruger's story had left a profound impact on me. A whole year passed, and Mrs. Kruger's previous room was occupied by multiple patients. Yet I always felt her presence there. I really did miss her. She was very kind and always made me excited to come to work. I decided to do something different for once for myself, and take a vacation to a country that I've never thought about myself going to. Germany. I wanted to see the grand tree that she had spoken of. She said it was beautiful, just as described in the Bible. Who knows if the tree was still standing after 89 years, even after the war. I put my vacation time, told Sarah about my plan, and set off for Germany. After a lengthy 20-hour flight, I finally arrived. I rented a car to drive around town where Mrs. Kruger had lived. She mentioned about living on a farm near a train station. I stayed for around 2 days, asking around about a farm near a train station until I finally got a lead. An older gentleman wasn't exactly sure what I was looking for, so he directed me to an old train station that had been around since the early 1900s, which was perfect for me to start. I parked my car and walked to the front of the train station, figuring it might be a challenge since the town seemed to be newer, possibly built over Mrs. Kruger's old farm. After walking around for a bit, I saw it. A very old, obvious 1930s Germanic-style home. It was refreshed with bright colors and filled with flowers. This has to be our home, I said to myself. I took this as a clue and pulled out my iPhone to check where north was. I followed that direction and just started to walk. She said in her story that she had to walk through trees, and I encountered a dense wooded area. This is what's making me a little confident that I was on the right path, so I proceeded forward. Getting minor cuts from the sticks, bark, and branches. It was very dense, but eventually I heard water. My excitement soared. I treacherously moved forward and faster, and I finally emerged into a small open field. There was a thin river, maybe a creek now. I saw the outline where it used to be a really wide river, but was now just a small flowing creek. I crossed the creek and felt a strange sensation that I was getting close. I don't know, but I felt a slight push. It's kind of hard to describe. What are the chances that Mrs. Kruger is piggybacking on me to this grand tree? The air seemed to grow thicker with each step, the forest around me almost whispering secrets of the past. I pushed through a dense underbrush, my skin catching on sharp twigs and low branches. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that made the forest feel both eerie and enchanting. The path became less clear as I ventured forward, but I kept moving north. Guided by a sense of purpose and a faint sound of running water, I reached another, a larger stream. This one was a lot thicker to cross, with slippery rocks and a stronger current. I carefully stepped from stone to stone, my heart racing with anticipation and the thrill of the journey. On the other side, the forest opened up slightly. I could see the sky again, painted with the warm hues of twilight. I trudged through the patches of wildflowers and thick ferns, my feet crushing on fallen leaves and branches. After what felt like an eternity, I noticed a change in the air. It felt charged, almost electric. I took a deep breath and continued forward. The forest seemed to be part before me, revealing a clearing bathed in golden light of the setting sun. And there it was. A tree with beautifully brown bark, rich green leaves, and almost perfectly round edges. The size was enormous, its branches stretching out as it embraced the sky. This tree must have continued growing since 1939. It stood like a guardian of secrets, a testament of time and resilience. This was definitely the grand tree Mrs. Kruger has spoken of. I felt a sense of accomplishment and awe. It was amazing. I approached it slowly, almost reverently. The bark was rough around my fingertips, and I could almost feel life pulsing through it. What are the chances that Mrs. Kruger is actually with me? I thought with a smile, feeling her presence more strongly than ever. As I circled the tree, I noticed something unusual at the base. I bent down and cleared away the overgrown grass and leaves, revealing a weathered gravestone. It was partially buried and covered in dirt, but the inscriptions were still legible. I took my phone out and used the iPhone's translation app. It's read, "To my innocent and sweet child Gunter. His life was short, but he was loved every second until his last breath. Gunter will be loved forever. From his father, Gunter Sr." Gunter Sr. He survived the war after all. He must have returned to find the child that he had never met. Mrs. Kruger's mother probably told him where the baby was buried. Then he placed his gravestone to honor the child at the base of this grand tree. As I stood there, I felt a gentle wind breeze and a warm feeling in my heart. It was as if the air itself carried a sense of peace and closure. I think Mrs. Kruger is with her child now and finally crossed over to paradise. The sun felt a bit radiant with bliss, casting a golden glow that seemed to envelop around me. I just felt good all of a sudden. My heart felt warm and light, as though a great weight has been lifted from my shoulders. I knew that her story, her courage, and her love would stay with me forever. With one last look at the grand tree, I turned and walked back towards the town. My heart filled with a renewed sense of peace and purpose. Mrs. Kruger's legacy would live on, not just in the stories I shared, but in the compassionate care that I will continue to provide to my patients. She had given me a gift, a reminder of the strength of the human spirit and the enduring power of love and memory.